Very good morning to all of you in Europe and very good afternoon in Asia. It's a pleasure to have you all here today joining us on the ARC9 report launch event titled Asia-Europe Higher Education Mapping, Working Towards the SDGs. My name is Reka Tózsa. I'm the Education Director at the Asia-Europe Foundation, and I'm going to be one of your moderators today for this session. It's a pleasure to have you here. This is a live recorded session. It will be available after the webinar. And it's also in a webinar mode. So if in case you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function. And please also include your name and country, if possible, after your question, so that our moderators can address you and your questions properly. We will also have the chat function on. We will just use this to send announcements. And I think the first one just popped up already. So today in this webinar, we prepared with an agenda for you for 1.5 hours. So we will start with the welcome remarks from our Executive Director, Toru Morikawa. And then we would like to give you a short overview of this project, the ASEF Regional Conference on Higher Education, that we refer to as ARC9 in short. And this is the framework of the study that is being launched today. The study has two parts. The study has two parts, and our researchers will be presenting them and also sharing the nexus with you, what is the relationship between those two studies, and then we will conclude. So I stop sharing and I invite our Executive Director, Ambassador Toru Morikawa, to share his opening welcome remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Reka. Dear ladies and gentlemen, friends from Asia and Europe, good afternoon from the Asia-Europe Foundation in Singapore, and a warm welcome to our speakers, discussants, and participants of today's webinar. Since ASEF's inception 25 years ago, our mission has always been rooted in promoting dialogue and collaboration between Asia and Europe to tackle the common global challenges we confront. The ASEF Regional Conference on Higher Education, ARC in short, is a prime example of how ASEF works towards common goals and places sustainable development at the center of dialogue and collaboration between Asia and Europe. ARC is the only bi-regional multi-stakeholder dialogue platform for university and student leaders, policymakers, and ministers to discuss higher education issues and shape the education landscape in Asia and Europe. For the past 10 years, ARC has continuously evolved and contributed with various outputs to the dialogues on the SDGs. As an official dialogue partner of the ASEM Education Ministers Meeting, it also helped to sustain a dynamic ASEM education process, discussing sustainable development as a horizontal priority. In the 9th edition of this project, we decided to study how higher education policies and practices within Asia and Europe work towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Working closely with a team of researchers, some of whom will be presenting later, we have developed the ARC9 report on Asia-Europe Higher Education Mapping, working towards the SDGs. This report that we are proud to launch today has two parts. The first part is focused on mapping how higher education policies in Asia and Europe contribute to the SDGs. We are grateful to all the policymakers and the government representatives who took the time to contribute and enabled us to map 31 national contexts in Asia and Europe. The second part of the study is focused on the existing sustainable development practices of higher education institutions across Asia and Europe. I'd like to express my gratitude to our partner, the International Association of Universities, AIU, who enabled us to this as a breakout report of the third AIU Global Survey on Higher Education and Research for Sustainable Development, HESD, as well as all the higher education institutional representatives who contributed to this survey. The rich data set is featuring 240 institutions based in 42 different countries in Asia and Europe. The findings of these studies provide invaluable insights on the significant contribution higher education plays in achieving not only SDG 4, quality education, but also other SDG goals. Additionally, this report brings to light how governments and their higher education policies support higher education institutions in advancing the SDGs. This report emphasizes the opportunities and the potential for governments and higher education institutions to further advance the SDGs, and especially through Asia-Europe collaboration. Our commitment to the UN 2030 agenda and to explore how higher education can contribute to sustainable development does not stop here. Throughout the year, ASEF will organize policy dialogues to discuss the key points emerging from this study and to further stimulate exchange of ideas between education policymakers, university, and student leaders across Asia and Europe. My sincere gratitude goes to our ARC9 researchers, speakers, and discussants, and all policymakers, higher education institution leaders, and partners who have worked with us on this project. I wish you insightful and inspiring exchanges today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Toru, for your encouraging words. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us today. So it's back to me to give you a brief overview of the project that we refer to as ARC, or the 9th edition of ARC, the ASEF Regional Conference on Higher Education. So this is a project that ASEF launched in 2008, so it's been running for almost 14 years and become a bi-regional multi-stakeholder platform for university leaders, policymakers, students, and education practitioners to come together and to discuss issues of joint interest, and also to find areas where they can collaborate better and take action. Throughout the last 14 years, this project has contributed to sustainable development in many ways. It was looking at the topic from very different angles, many very different angles, such as employment, quality education, or governance for sustainable development. But it was always with two key goals or two key aims. First one is really to facilitate exchanges of good practices and enable networking among stakeholders in Asia and Europe. And the other one is to inform policymakers of the 51 Asia-Europe meeting partner countries, and also to trigger discussions among them. So last year, we decided to take a step back and look at the topic of sustainable development from the big picture again. This is also because the ASEM education process, our official dialogue partner, have decided to put sustainable development as a horizontal priority of their political process when they are discussing higher education, and also because the World Higher Education Conference launched its report titled Beyond Limits, New Ways to Reinvent Higher Education, and we thought higher education institutions, policymakers, and students should really come together and find these new ways to collaborate on sustainable development as well. So that's why we initiated this project to have two complementary parts. One part is looking at higher education policies, across our 51 partner countries. And we wanted to find answers to questions: to what extent are national higher education policies oriented towards the SDGs? If they are, then where are the key policy priorities? And if there are priorities, then what kind of policy tools are used to promote sustainable development in higher education in Asia and Europe? At the same time, we wanted to conduct a parallel study looking at the practice, what higher education institutions already do to contribute to the SDGs, what are the different strategies, which missions of the universities are most often targeted. Do they focus more on teaching, or research, or third mission, or another one maybe? And what are the most common institutional barriers to take action on sustainable development? So we engaged a wonderful team of researchers to help us to compile these studies. And we also had wonderful partners, the International Association of Universities, like Ambassador Morikawa mentioned already, who shared with us data on Asia, Europe, higher education institutional practices, which we included into this report as well, to be able to put next to the policy data and draw conclusions. So today, we will have a quick presentation on the policies, and then another one on the institutional practices, and then we will open the floor for discussion with our wonderful discussants who joined us today. Thank you so much. And then this part of the session will be moderated by our lead researcher. But with this, let me give the floor to ASEF Regional Conference. She will present the findings of the first part of the study on the policy research. And she's speaking on behalf of the research team who's authoring this part of the study, on behalf of Anomoni Yoshi and Dr. Miguel Antonio Lim as well. And while IC starts the presentation, we will also share the link to the study in the chat for your reference, so you can already open it and scroll through it, but I would really encourage you to pay attention to IC because she designed the key messages of this study really well, and she will be able to summarize it nicely. Thank you so much. IC, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Just checking that you can all hear me well and that you can see the presentation on the screen.
All works well, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Reika, for that wonderful introduction, and also to Ambassador Tori Morikawa for the welcoming remarks. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm IC Fresno Anabo, and on behalf of the ARC9 research team, it is my absolute pleasure to be here with you today and to be presenting the study on higher education policymakers' perspectives on the SDGs. So without further ado, let me begin with my presentation. All right, so just an overview, and as was mentioned already before, the study aimed to map what is being done by national governments in ASEM countries to support higher education institutions to contribute to the SDGs. And for this, we have these 4 research questions that were also already covered by Reika before to guide the study. And so to answer these questions that I've just showed you, we collected evidence over several months from July to December 2022 using 3 data collection methods. So first, we carried out a rapid evidence review of academic and gray literature to scope the field and also help us in designing the data collection instruments. We used the findings from this review to design and pilot the survey. And we also implemented exploratory focus group discussions alongside the survey in order to validate and triangulate the survey results. We aim to cover as many ASEM countries as possible and had to extend the data collection window beyond the cutoff date as marked by this dotted line and until December in order to include more responses. We then analyzed the quantitative and qualitative data between December and February, in addition to regular consultations with the advisory board composed of experts in the field to further enhance the report. So overall, the findings on policymakers' perspectives I'll be presenting today represent 31 ASEM countries. 29 of them participated in the survey, while a little less than half, or 12 countries, were able to participate in both the survey and the focus group discussions. So in a rapid evidence review, we found that there is a lack of survey-based studies that specifically focus on national higher education policies and the SDGs, which also speaks to the relevance of ARC9's work in this regard. And of this scarce literature that we found, we came across the Decode project. It's a European Commission funded project that sought to survey how deans and academic leaders embed sustainability in their academic departments. So the Decode project actually drew on a well-established policy framework developed by Anne Schneider and Helen Ingram in 1990, which covers 5 types of policy instruments and the underlying behaviors that they address. So these 5, as you can see in the slide, are incentive tools, which may come in the form of financial support and reputational incentives, authority tools such as legal obligations and accreditation requirements, symbolic tools in the form of government documents and statements of priorities, capacity building tools such as providing access to information, infrastructure, and facilities, and learning tools that allow actors to assess and to evaluate their progress to enhance outcomes. So this framework was used in analyzing the findings, which we will now turn to. Overall, there are 10 main points that we wish to highlight, but you're free to consult, of course, the report for the more extensive version. All right, so the first main finding is that evidence from the survey suggests that governments play a key role in SDG implementation in higher education, where more than half of the respondents said it is the government that is most responsible for this action. So this is also interesting because it suggests a sense of ownership on the SDGs among governments. When asked about the government's roles in the implementation of the SDGs in higher education, establishing a common vision came out on top. Meanwhile, enforcing regulations and providing funding were also ranked highly. Another finding that emerged relates to SDG priorities. So according to the survey, and in no particular order, ASEM respondents identified the following SDGs as their priorities: SDG 4, quality education; SDG 5, gender equality; SDG 8, decent work and economic growth; SDG 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure; and SDG 10, reduced inequalities. The fourth main finding is that more than half of the total number of ASEM survey respondents answered yes to having an existing national reference document to guide higher education action towards the SDGs. And these documents are either part of a broader national agenda or as a standalone higher education strategy. And examples of these national documents cited included strategies, declarations or implementation plans, national reports, and also international and European intergovernmental guiding documents. So just to give you some examples of the actual titles of these documents. So in Ireland, the second National Implementation Plan for the Sustainable Development Goals. In Switzerland, it's called the 2030 Sustainable Development Strategy. In India, it is called the National Education Policy 2020. And in Cambodia, the Higher Education Vision 2030. So in this slide, you'll just see a list of ASEM countries who reported having this reference document. As you can see, several countries in Asia and Europe do have them, while a few, such as Brunei Darussalam, China, Japan, Belgium, Bulgaria, Cyprus, and Luxembourg, indicated no in this item, although there were references to other policy tools, but just not the reference document. And while others reported that this document is currently being developed. So that's Lao PDR, Myanmar, Croatia, and Greece. Okay, so in the survey, we also found that SDG implementation in higher education in ASEM countries are either carried out on a voluntary basis with no formal appointment or through a national government department or agency. So in the survey, we also tried to investigate the policy process through which ASEM countries translate the global agenda into national and local goals. And the items reflected in this survey question, and as you can see in the slide, reflects these key policy steps identified in literature. So it was found that among ASEM countries, the most commonly conducted steps refer to the initial stages of the policy process, including review of national plans and strategies and the mainstreaming of existing and new strategies, while slightly fewer respondents reported undertaking the later steps of the policy process, such as assessment of interlinkages and trade-offs and monitoring arrangements and follow-up. So this finding actually aligns with existing literature tells us about the implementation gaps relating to these later steps. Now moving on to which stakeholders are involved in the SDG implementation of these key policy steps. So we found that higher education institutions are the second most commonly involved, less so than national governments, but more so than provincial and local stakeholders, NGOs, and industry players. However, as you can see in the chart, they are involved slightly less in the later stages, including monitoring and follow-up. So looking more closely into the missions of higher education institutions most often targeted by national policies, education and teaching came on top, followed by research. When we analyzed the contents of the cited key documents that the respondents provided in the survey, we also found that policies tend to highlight the link between these two, between teaching and research, where systematically incorporating research findings into teaching approaches on the one hand, and the greater involvement of higher education teachers on the other are viewed as important. The cited reference in the documents also alluded to how these missions are targeted in practice. So just to give you some examples, for example, in education and teaching, in India, the national policy promotes offering credit-based courses on sustainable development topics, including environmental education. In Slovenia, there is a goal to make databases more accessible to aid in research. In Finland, there is a strong reference to the importance of partnerships between higher education and industry. And in Germany, existing policy encourages funding sustainable construction, including campus buildings. So the ninth finding we wish to highlight is that incentives in the form of financial support is the most commonly employed policy tool among ASEM respondents. So out of the 29, 26 actually said that they are employing this form of policy tool. And so in this slide, I will show you beyond the incentives, some examples of the incentive tools, but also the other policy tools in specific Asian and European countries. So in terms of incentives in the Philippines, they have what they call the Grants and Aid Program, which provides targeted funding to support universities in carrying out research in SDG relevant areas. In Austria, the Sustainability Awards is a nationwide competition that seeks to recognize outstanding efforts along 8 higher education dimensions. And this was also generated as a way to promote long-term participatory and reflective learning among higher education institutions. For authority tools, Bangladesh pointed out that their quality assurance frameworks in higher education were a product of the Agenda for Sustainable Development and the SDGs. In Switzerland, the Higher Education Act of 2011 stipulates that one of the criteria for higher education accreditation is addressing aspects of sustainability in higher education institutions' work. Meanwhile, for capacity building in Malaysia, they have a program called Industry Centers of Excellence, and which was identified in their national document. And this seeks to encourage industry stakeholders to set up laboratories and teaching facilities in higher education institutions in order to provide students with exposure to the latest technologies around specific clusters. In Finland, training and consultation services are also provided to support policy priorities. When it comes to symbolic tools, in India, national policy indicates adding credit-based courses and projects in higher education institutions to reflect sustainable on environmental education in the curriculum, while in Germany, existing policy documents encourage higher education institutions to reflect sustainable development in their mission statements. Last but not the least, for learning tools, Mongolia developed a national level set of targets and indicators for quality education, while developing annual reports and presenting disaggregated data are being done in the UK. So when asked about perceived barriers to higher education institutions contributing to the SDGs, the policymakers cited structural issues most commonly, and this would include challenges as just lack of time, lack of funding, human resources, and infrastructure. This is followed by strategic issues, which includes a lack of or unclear strategy on the SDGs. So these barriers present areas of policy action that can be strengthened in order to better support higher education's contributions towards the SDGs. So to conclude, and taking into account these findings and the ones outlined in the report, we have outlined 5 recommendations for national policymakers. So firstly, there is a need to develop closer collaborations between policymakers and higher education institutions and effectively use available evidence through research to develop policy actions and solutions in higher education towards sustainable development. Secondly, vision statements and strategic plans should be monitored so they may generate concrete action steps, clear responsibilities, and indicators of progress towards social impact. It is also recommended that multiple stakeholders participate in SDG relevant policymaking, including higher education institutions, but also local actors such as local governments, NGOs, and industry players. Fourthly, there is a need to shore up targeted support for other university missions beyond education and research when tackling the SDGs, especially partnerships and societal engagement. And lastly, there is a continued need to fund and support future studies that will collect evidence on the achievements and challenges of policy interventions, including those cited in the report, to further build on the efforts to contribute to the SDGs in and through higher education. Thank you so much. That is all for the policymakers' perspectives. Let me pass you on to Reka for the next part of this presentation.
Thank you so much, Icy, for presenting the findings of this study in these 10 concise points. It's very interesting. So if any of you are policymakers today in the audience being with us, I hope these 10 points already triggered some questions or insights. Feel free to post them in the Q&A function. And I also see some of you who contributed to the report were also able to join us today live. Thank you so much, really appreciate it. So if you would like to add on something, maybe also feel free to post in the Q&A function. And with this, let us go to the second part of the study. And I invite Dr. Anumoni Yoshi for RMIT University from Australia to present these findings. It's almost evening there, Anumoni. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation as well.
Thank you, Reka, and good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, in whichever part of the world you are. My name is Anumoni Joshi, and I will be presenting the higher education perspective today, just to provide a little bit perspective on our study and how we conducted this study. The overarching aim of our study was to map the higher education policies and practices, advancing sustainable development in ASEM partner countries. And in order to do so, our study conceptualized the understanding of the sustainability development in the regional, cultural, and political context, and broadly relied on development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. And the main dimensions of cross-cutting considerations as summarized were the 5 Ps, that is the people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. With that note, I'll move on with my presentation, and And thank you, International Association of Universities, for providing us with the rich and valuable data. Our report is prepared in collaboration with the International Association of Universities, and we anticipate the findings from this report will help to showcase the development regarding the sustainable development goals in the higher education sector and help universities to implement good practices in sustainability aspects. So I'll just move on. The total respondents from this survey, we examined the 51 ASEM partner countries, 119 respondents from the Asian countries, and 121 from the Europe. It's quite an equal representation here, but just to be mindful here, the third IAU global survey that was conducted by the IAU had obtained 464 responses from 120 countries, which is a larger study. And in our study, we have made some attempt to bring this global perspective by elucidating some of the findings from the third IAU global survey, just for additional insights for our study. So before we move on to the findings sections, I would like to contextualize our study in relation to the Sustainable Development Goal and as a whole of institution approach. The whole of institution approach is stemmed from the belief that higher education has been at the forefront of sustainable development from the early beginning. Lately, the higher education approaches towards the engagement of SDGs have become more manifold in teaching and research, and then it extended to the operations and beyond. So higher education and the whole of institutional approach requires higher education institution to adopt certain educational sustainable development principles, and our study basically relied on these principles, that addressing access to and the retention is affordable quality of education at the tertiary level, reorienting teaching and research to address sustainability, building awareness and understanding of sustainable development with its implication for the graduates, universities, surrounding community, and also provide training for all staff to promote sustainability in the workplace and at home. Now, with that background, I'd like to move to the main findings, and I have got 10 points for the deliberation in my today's presentation. I'll be discussing this key 10 points from the findings of our study. When the question was asked in the survey, in which areas has your institution engaged with the sustainable development, we observed that the sustainable development has been a cross-cutting theme across the education, research, community engagement, and campus operations. While teaching and learning and research activities are most engaged with the SDG in both the regions, both Europe and Asia, there are regional differences as observed here in this pattern. Even in the third IAU global survey, the data also shows that teaching and learning is the area in which the highest reported engagement, almost at 86%. So the findings are quite similar here. SD cut across all levels for implementation, but there are also regional differences. Now moving on to the next question, on what level is sustainability development supported in your institution? And we see that responses in this slide that SDs are cut across all levels of implementation, but there are few regional differences as reflected in this item. It's institution-wide. I think we'll still have to move, stay at slide 2. As noted, there are also commonalities and distinctive differences in how the sustainable development is conceptualized, strategized, and implemented across in Asia and Europe due to the differences in size and scale, governance, and administration in the higher education institution represented in both the regions. And again, to celebrate these commonalities, our study has recommended sharing best practices with one another, and also to develop effective communication platforms and mechanism to communicate with each other in order to mediate competing expectations and interest. With that, I'll move to the point number 3. In this context, the survey asks the question, which specific unit is in charge of sustainability activities in your institution? And at the institution level, sustainability development is managed at the leadership level, sustainable office or sustainable development department, and the faculty or the department level. And as we note here, the academic staff and students are most involved in sustainable development actions. It's also an interesting observation in the EU region sustainability office and the SD department, but whereas in the Asia, it's more of the faculty departments are highly engaged. The response analyzed in our study are in sync with the finding from the global survey data as well, with the slight regional variation as has been evident in the slide here. I'll move on to the next item. In this slide, our question in the survey was asked, who is most involved in sustainable development in your institution? And the respondent, as we perceive in this slide, that the three key stakeholders were cited as most involved in the sustainable development, but at various percentages. Academic staff takes the lead, and I think it is good in my point of view, followed by the leadership level and also students. As we recognize the importance of youth in the current world and their potential in shaping our world for tomorrow, we think empowering youth can take a lead in this context. Also, as evident here, the responses analyzed by our study are also in sync with the finding from the IU global level data, and there is no regional variations as observed in the slide. I'll move to the point number 5 now, and in this slide, the question that survey answered was, what were the assessment, monitoring, evaluation tools or mechanism for the sustainable development actions in your organization? And as we observed from the slide, the institution, the higher education institution, use external ranking, reporting to the leadership, working groups in monitoring, evaluating sustainable development actions. And there is a variation between EU as reporting. Leadership is the most engaged and Asia is the external ranking. So the responses from our study are again in sync with the finding with the third IAU global survey, and there's no regional differences observed in this item. I'll move to the next item now. That's the point number 6. Yeah, this is an interesting question, that which of the following difficulties or challenges have been asked about the impediments or the implementation of SDG at the higher education institutions, and both EU and Asia indicated that funding is a major challenge, but there are certain, again, regional differences that emerge in the two regions. For the top challenges in the Asia, it's mostly the lack of funding, lack of training opportunities, and lack of cooperation with other stakeholders, whereas on the top challenges in the Europe is lack of funding and lack of staff and lack of institutional recognitions. However, it is also important to note and observe here that in my view, it will be interesting to see where the funding is needed, and perhaps a more research is required to understand these aspects of requirement. Also, the finding from our study sample are different from the findings from the report at IAU in the global survey, as it is explicit from this slide. And in this context, our study provides some recommendations that providing training on sustainable development in the higher education institution, and such training should include the UN agenda and also the UN Sustainable Development Goals, education for sustainable development, and global citizenship, and also to produce and share training resources related to sustainable development across the institute. I'll move on to the point number 7 now. In this slide, the survey question was, at what level does your institution partner with other higher education institutions? And the higher education institution, we observe that they collaborate with institutions at diverse level, from local to global. However, we see from the slide that national level engagement is slightly higher in both Asia and the Europe region. Again, the responses analyzed in our study are in sync with the finding with the IAU third global survey, and there is no regional difference observed in this context. In this context, again, our study recommends the policymakers and the higher education leaders to collaborate with the stakeholders at the local, national, and the global level to explore joint capacity development opportunities, or physically and or online, and to share best practices among each other. I'll move on to the next item now. Item 8. Here the question was asked in the survey, which of the following opportunities support the implementation of sustainable development in your institution? And this slide reflects the opportunities the higher education institution want to engage. And this was an open-ended question with the multiple choice question indeed. And the top priorities engaging with the SDGs are highly different in the Asia and the Europe region. For instance, the top opportunities in Asia are training opportunities, leadership support, and new initiatives. And for top opportunities in Europe are the new initiative, engaging initiatives, leadership support, and dedicated staff. The finding from a study for the Europe sample are again different from the finding reported in the third IU Global Survey. I'll move to the next item, item 9. In this context, the question was asked in the survey, what kind of national policy instrument impact on your institution when it comes to engaging with 2030 agenda? And overall, the higher education institution in the ASEM countries are supported by 3 types of policy instrument, encouraging higher education institutions to contribute towards the sustainable development goals. That is the regulations, incentive, and capacity development tools. Again, the responses analyzed in our study are in sync with the finding with the third IAU Global Survey, and there is no regional difference observed in this particular question. In consideration of these findings, our study recommends developing a policy tool and instrument that strengthens the sustainability development action. And we all know it's more people-to-people connectivity, since success for the global goal is in the sum of individual actions rather than, and also including the education institution from students, staff, universities, administrative, local, and industry players. That brings to the point number 10, and this is quite explicit from the slide that in this context, the question was asked, I mean, to indicate which SGD in your institution is active on which level, whether it's education, teaching, research, community engagement, or campus initiative. And from the higher education perspective, it was mentioned that SGD 9, 10, and 4 and 5 are the most engaged SGDs. So these were the 10 key points from the higher education perspective. But I was fortunate to take part in both the study as a researcher, and I was involved in both from the policymakers perspective as well as from the higher education institution perspective studies. So I will be presenting this nexus between the two studies and a few fine points. The first thing that came to my mind was the research design as a researcher. So I always think of the conceptual framework, how do we design the research? As noted, the first study used the conceptual lens, drawing on the policy theory from the Snyder and Encram, as my colleague IC presented in detail at the beginning of our presentation. And this was also employed by the Decode project. And our second study, that is from the higher education institution perspective, it focused on the whole of institution approach. However, after closely examining the IAU survey design, it was noted that analytical framework used in both the studies are to an extent similar from Snyder and Skinner, in which they identified 5-dimensional framework of the policy instrument through which the university leaders can encourage sustainability initiative in their academic units. And these were the strategy awareness building, monitoring, and organizational and learning tools, capacity building, using incentives, providing authority. And these elements are present in the first study as well as from the policymakers' perspective, but there were 2 additional elements that we incorporated in our design of the first study, that is the policymakers' perspective of the symbolic and the learning tools. With that, I'll move on to the next. Knowledge is, I think the both studies also uncovered the knowledge gap that persisted with regard to the sustainable development, which actually points to the opportunity for the capacity development and multi-level collaboration that will enable us to share our practices. The next thing that comes up is the higher education mission. It was observed through the literature review as higher education institutions are seen as playing a fundamental role in contributing to SDGs, especially around their core missions, including education and teaching, research, campus operation, governance, partnership, and societal engagement. Several ASEM partner countries also informed the importance of bridging the gap between the teaching and the research, systematically incorporating the research findings into teaching approaches, as well as a greater involvement of the higher education teachers in the research to boost the higher education contribution to the SDGs. And from the policymakers' perspective, we noted that examples from the Germany, Switzerland, Ireland, and Hungary, they assert the importance of addressing sustainable development in the curriculum and learning materials, while there is a pedagogical innovations also featured in several of the national strategy documents. And another interesting aspects that both the study talk about is mediating the local priorities with the global agenda. In both the studies, the SDG 4 stands out as a top priority. As we've seen from the example here in Greece, the higher education institutions are keen to work with all levels of stakeholders, prioritizing the local goals with the global goals. Again, while contextualizing the United Nations 2030 agenda and SDG in the country's higher education context, some of the ASEM countries indicated implementation of key steps. And one example I can recall is from the Ireland that engaged a lot of stakeholders in the consultative process to come up with their national strategy. So next I'll move on with the next slide. I think the stakeholders engagement. Here again, the both studies point to a range of stakeholders engagement. From policymakers' perspective, the role of the central and the state governments are prominent, and both studies also found the limited involvement among the provincial or the state governments and NGOs and industry players, especially when mapping the prioritizing and adapting the SDG targets. And another interesting aspects that both study talked about the policy instrument, and both studies highlighted the importance of national policy instruments. The policy makers identified financial incentives as the most common used policy tool, followed by the authority tools such as accreditation requirements and symbolic tools, featuring these tools in their national plans and strategies related to SDGs. Whereas from the perspective of the higher education institution indicate that the national tools such as regulations, incentives, and capacity development tools impact the sustainable development actions in their institution. And finally, both the studies also, the higher education policymakers as well as the institution highlighted areas for further improvement and to enhance contribution of the higher education to the SDGs. The financial and the manpower were cited as the common constraint between both the region, Europe and Asia. I think that brings to the end of this, and I'll have some few concluding remarks. I'd just like to say that overall, the two perspectives in the study offer important contribution regarding the national governments and the universities. Universities are also doing in terms of achieving the SDGs. These two studies provide an important understanding about the SDGs, how the SDGs are perceived, prioritized, and understood by a range of stakeholders, but by primarily the higher education stakeholders. Now, after presenting the main findings of these two studies, There are also interconnections. We would like to end this presentation with the thought that 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals provides us with a common goal to move forward. And we have seen how there is a diversity actions and focus among ASEAN countries. We should celebrate what have been achieved so far on the front, and also recognize the challenges and areas that give us more chance to do more and better. To conclude, we would like to acknowledge the diverse knowledge and experience that we can all bring to the conversation. And we encourage everyone to engage in continuous dialogue with each other in addressing the barriers of implementing 2030 agenda, and collectively shape our engagement with the agenda by prioritizing sustainable development goals that impact our local communities. And thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to deeper conversation and about how higher education can contribute to the sustainable development goals.
Thank you so much for the lovely presentation, Anumoni. Really nicely done. I hope it inspired further questions and further thoughts. I see many higher education managers here with us today as well. Thank you so much for joining. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function, because we arrived to the second part of the session when questions and answers will be in the center. So this second part of the webinar will be moderated by Dr. Miguel Lim. Miguel is a senior lecturer in education and international development and the impact coordinator of the Manchester Institute of Education. He's based in Manchester, University of Manchester. He will be coordinating the discussion with our discussants. So we are very lucky that 3 excellent discussants accepted our invitation, and it's my pleasure to briefly introduce them and then give them over to Miguel to moderate the second part of the session. So we have Ms. Isabel Thoman with us here today. She's the program officer at the International Association of Universities, and she's in charge of the portal of sustainable development, higher education for sustainable development portal and initiatives. Before joining IAU, Isabel was working also in higher education sector, various countries. So she also brings a wealth of expertise from the practitioner side. But today we asked her to come from an international university association perspective. Then second discussant we have here today is Professor Pornchai Monkonvanit. Professor Pornchai is the president of Siam University, and he's also the chair of Higher Education for Sustainable Development Cluster at the International Association of Universities. So he's a very good overview of the global survey as well, and also the Asia-Europe breakout report that we did, but we asked him today to focus on the institutional perspective. And third, we have Ms. Anna Shinwad with us. She's the head of unit for sustainability in higher education at the Federal Ministry of Education, Science and Research in Austria. Anna was also instrumental in helping us putting together the report, and she contributed with very valuable insights how things are done in Austria. So we asked her to reflect on the findings from policymaker perspective. Thank you so much. And then with this, it's over to Miguel to moderate the second part and also start to weaving in the questions from the Q&A function. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reka, and thank you so much to the Asia Europe Foundation for the opportunity to bring all of this research together, and also to have an excellent opportunity to discuss it and enter into a dialogue with policy experts and institutional representatives in the field. So I'd ask our discussants, first of all, to give their first reactions to this study, perhaps 5 minutes each, and then we will widen the discussion into a round table, bringing together also our researcher presenters, Dr. Aisien Abufresna and Dr. Anumoni Yoshi. I'd also like to mention as well that myself and another member of the team, Dr. Doria Abdullah, are also present on this webinar today. And even though we won't be present in the discussion, we are we are part of this wider dialogue about these important issues raised by the ARC9 project. So thank you again. First, we'll go, as Reka mentioned, to Ms. Isabel Thoman for her remarks, her 5-minute remarks on the 2 studies that have just been presented. Thank you so much, Isabel. The floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miguel Lim, and hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining this event today. I would like to thank first ASEF for organizing this great event and for conducting these very important studies, and to the whole team of researchers and from the Secretariat that have been involved in this endeavor. My name is Isabel Thoman, and I work as Program Officer for Higher Education and Research for Sustainable Development at the International Association of Universities. We are a global organization which is over 70 years old, based at UNESCO in Paris, France. And we've been working with ASEF also for several years, so they're a key partner for us in the region on higher education and several topics. We as an association, we work on various topics. We work also on internationalization, leadership, and digital transformation. But this work on sustainable development is very close to my heart, and that's why it's also this important to have the studies, to bring it to the regional level and to make this connection to the policy level. What I would have liked to stress from Dr. Yoshi's presentation of part 2, so the higher education part, the institutional side is the whole institution approach, which is a concept that the IAU has been working on with UNESCO and is communicating to our members, higher education institutions, as a very useful approach in working with sustainable development more broadly, but with SDGs in particular as a framework to bring forward sustainability actions on an institutional level, which includes teaching and learning, research, campus and operations, and community engagement, and also, of course, partnerships as the fundamental enabler of a lot of cooperations that happen within the university, but then also with external partners, including governments. When the IAU conducted last year their 3rd survey on higher education and research for sustainable development, we did work in an expert group to adapt the questionnaire compared to the 2019 and 2016 survey to the needs, increasingly looking also at the sustainable development goals, but also at sustainable development and education for sustainable development as more general concepts that are very important also to investigate their understanding within universities and higher education. We did want to find out how HEIs, how higher education institutions engage with the sustainable development goals, what their understanding is of sustainable development. Is it environmental? Is it economic? Is it social? Or is it this holistic framework that encompasses all these dimensions as the sustainable development goals aim to do? And as Dr. Yoshi already said, we received 464 responses from 120 countries all over the world. And I would like just to say at the global perspective, which resonates a lot, what also then happened at the regional level, I wanted to just briefly stress some key takeaways that we had from the analysis of this global data set. And I might say also that we launched the global report in January, and that there's the global report also available online on our website to look at. So what we found mainly were that the higher education institutions have identified the SDGs as a framework, and they work across the different disciplines and areas with this framework, which is considering that the SDGs have been adopted in 2015, and first examples have happened in 2017, a lot in the Pacific Asia area. It's quite recent for a higher education institution, and it's increasingly really the interest and the usefulness of this framework is becoming apparent, and it links to previously existing actions that were under sustainability and environmental sustainability, but also very strongly in research on other fields. We have seen also from the previous slide, so thank you so much for already showing them, I can refer to them. The second point, SDG cuts across all levels of implementation. So this is very much the observation that we've also have made, that it's used in different areas of activity that's institution, the third slide from Dr. Yoshi also, that different units are in charge. So this is a bit the question, who's actually in charge of sustainability activities? And in this question, leadership was identified as being in charge of defining the sustainability agenda at the institutions. But a slight contrast, and that is what I find very interesting, is that in the question who is actually involved in implementing the actions, students and academics are mostly mentioned. So we do see a slight difference against the question who's in charge and who's actually implementing the actions. And what that tells us is that we need a top-down approach and that we need a clear strategy setting from the leadership, but we also need very much the bottom-up initiatives from students and from staff. We do have slight regional differences, but the trends really go across all regions. But we have a stronger need to stress these examples of good practice, to connect between higher education institutions, increase the visibility of higher education institutions, and work with policymakers. And that's where I come to the study one part of this great research project. This is very important to make this nexus between the two, and to then have really governments giving incentives and tools for institutions to engage with the SDGs. So thank you very much. I think I've talked enough, and I would like to give it back to you at this point, Dr. Lim.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and bang on time. Thank you so much for those thoughts, and also for telling us a little bit more about the IAU and the wider context of the study and the data where it comes from. Obviously, we know that to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, it's not just policymakers and universities in Asia and Europe, but obviously globally where we need this action. But the insights that you provided are hopefully things that we'll return to in the roundtable discussion. Now, may I ask Professor Pornchai? It's good as well to be on the same platform as Professor Pornchai again. We presented some of these insights together in Bangkok recently, and I hope that he can see that the work has developed since. I think Professor Pornchai is in an excellent position to give the perspective from the higher education institutions perspective, because apart from all of the roles that were mentioned earlier by Rekha, Professor Pornchai is also the president of the private universities in Thailand. And again, with this variety of HEIs across the world, I think it's important to see as well, right, like different groups under different organizational structures, all doing their part to contribute to the SDGs. Professor Pornchai, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very much delighted to be in this session. Firstly, because I also involved during the survey design of this survey, and I believe that this is the third survey that IAU has made. And I think that in this survey, we can see that the roles of Europe and Asia is quite important, because if we look at the number of respondents, in Europe, we have about 30%, in Asia Pacific, another 30%. And within Asia and Europe, I think that there are a lot of things that we can help each other. And I like the presentation of the comic strip that we have many kinds of animals, and then everyone like to make a better future for the world. But it doesn't mean that we have to do the same thing. Diversity is quite important. And I think that especially in Asia, there are a lot of diversity. And I think the success of SDG will depend on how you can work with diversity and make it most effective. And if we look at the situation now, I think that we have war, we have climate crisis, we have health pandemic, and we have like a lot of flooding and environmental degradation. And if we try to think how we got this, I think that this kind of problem is partly because of of our research and innovation, but we have only trying to make our life easier, but we haven't considered well enough the cost of this kind of innovation. So I think that it's time that the university around the world have to work on this, because it's also a part of our question, a part of our problems. And I think that I also believe that whole institution approach is a very good approach. And I think that when we look at Asia and Europe, I think it's like the comic strip. I mean, we have to do the different thing with the same goal to make it achieve. And I think that for the university, I think that we have to reconsider also our educational system, our delivery system, our research system. I think that it's time that we can reinvent our university and higher education system, having SDG as the framework. And one thing that I think that we should not forget is during the time, we have lost some kind of way of life and wisdom that might be very useful, such as I still remember when I was a shy, I drink water with this glass, but not this. I also, I mean, we use a lot of like very sustainable way of life, and probably it might be the time that we consider about our traditional, especially Asian traditional way of life, and also our traditional wisdom as well. I think that if we can change way of life and also trying to recultivate some kind of traditional wisdom, this also can help. And I think that when I'm talking about the higher education, I think, and also reinventing, I think that at the end, I think that with SDG, it can be an effective tool to redirect or reinventing our higher education. I'm also very happy today that we have representatives from IAU, from ASEF, and also other organizations to working together. I think that we are the one who accounted for. So I think that as a university, we have to help together and do more, but do differently. And I also like to add one more thing. If you try to consider the result of the survey, we can see that if we comparing the result of the survey from the first one and second one, I think that we have done a better job. But there's still a lot of things that we can even make it better. And so I think that it's a very challenging time. And in our university and in Thailand, I think that we also have to work with the policymaker to link the university with the community. I think that since the time is running out, so I'd like to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pornchai. I particularly like the very concrete example that you gave about even the simple act of drinking water, of eating, and how we can embed sustainability practices in those individual actions, which obviously can be something that can be done at an institutional level, right? Changes in practices in the canteens and cafeterias, for instance, of universities can potentially be, well, one action among many in line with the achievement of the SDGs. And finally, last but not very much not the least, we have also a policymaker's perspective from Anna Schwinwald. I think it's important to know that we relied very much on the generosity and the time of representatives from national governments, from ministries of education, higher education, or science and technology, of which Ms. Anna Schwinwald is one. We also, I think one of the goals was also to highlight what were the different policy tools that different countries were using. And as we saw, that there are a variety of tools. Austria, where I believe Ms. Anna is from, was highlighted with regard to their sustainability awards. I hope that she and her colleagues will find as well, apart from helping others know what Austria is doing and this best practice from Austria, our hope is that policymakers like Anna will also be able to see the range of policies and policy tools that are being used in other countries as well. This is hopefully one area of dialogue and of learning that we can promote through the ARC9 study. But Anna, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in today's panel and to share some of my thoughts on the report and its findings. Before doing so, I would like to express my appreciation to the authors and all other people involved in the creation of the report. As somebody who is new to the whole ASEF world, I have to say that I was very impressed by the richness and professionalism of this report. And from my perspective, the report has two main strengths. First, the insight into other countries' national higher education institutions' policies towards the SDGs. And second, and almost more significant for me as somebody representing the policymakers' perspectives, a deeper understanding of higher education institutions' requirements, needs, and aspirations of so many countries all over Europe and Asia. While reading the report, I was partly surprised about the answers of the other participants and the results of the report. And as a result, I in fact discovered some blind spots in my own work. So I identified 3 topics, results of the studies I would like to highlight. And the first topic is already policy tools. As Dr. Lim has already mentioned, and as Dr. Yoshi has mentioned in her presentation, I think it's quite remarkable that when we talk about policy instruments, both stakeholder groups, the policymakers and the higher education institutions highlight the importance of national policies for sustainable development. But when we take a closer look at the kind of policy tools that seem most important to the 2 stakeholder groups, we do see a discrepancy. While policymakers identify financial incentives as the most commonly used policy tools, followed by accreditation requirements and national plans and strategies, higher education institutions stated that regulations, incentives, and capacity development tools impact sustainable development action in their institutions. So I think it is very interesting, and as a policymaker, we should ask ourselves if we use the right policy instruments to promote sustainable development in higher education. Should we focus more or less on regulation? How is this compatible with higher education institutions' autonomy? So I think these are some very crucial questions. There is a second aspect regarding policy tools I would like to mention. And thank you for the slides on the country examples of policy tools, which shows that there is a broad toolbox for the promotion of SDGs. And in fact, Austria is currently using a very limited number of tools, namely budget allocation via performance agreements between universities and the ministry, as well as awards. So in addition, we have anchored the importance of the SDGs in our main national higher education strategies. However, we don't have special units that give advice to higher education institutions on how to implement the SDGs as other countries do. We don't have accreditation requirements taking sustainability into account, and we don't provide any capacity building. So these are definitely some blind spots that I identified when reading the report, and I think I should consider in addressing in the future. The second point I would like to highlight is from the second part of the study regarding higher education policymakers' perspective. There is one finding that sustainable development is managed at leadership level. And Isabel Thoman has already mentioned this in her presentation. To my mind, it's absolutely crucial that you have a very strong leadership. We need higher education leaders who recognize that the SDGs and sustainability are the key topics of our generation. However, due to the autonomy of higher education institution, it is sometimes very difficult from a ministry's perspective to impose measures for the implementation of the SDGs in the higher education institutions' missions, like teaching and research, outreach, and so on. So it takes a lot of effort to convince some leaders, not all, that sustainability is key. Still, although we are we know the which harms that climate change is causing and so on. So this is something where we have to focus in the future, and we also have to use and support bottom-up initiatives within the higher education institutions who are really drivers of sustainable development within their institutions. There's one last point I would like to mention briefly, because it seems very important to me, and this is the policy recommendation to develop closer cooperation between higher education institutions and policymakers, especially when we talk about strategy development. I fully agree with the recommendation of the report on this point, and we know that people from the higher education institutions, they are the experts. I mean, they have all the knowledge, and they tell us since decades what we have to do to develop into a more sustainable future, to stop climate change and so on. So it's really important to listen to the experts. However, it is extremely difficult to include the higher education institutions into design and monitoring of sustainable development policies, because very often the experts are not our direct communication partners. It's like the leaderships of the higher education institutions. And just to give you an idea, Austria has a population of approximately 9 million people. So we are a very small country, but we do have 75 different higher education institutions of 4 different kinds. We have public universities, private universities, universities of applied sciences, and university colleges of teacher training. So they all work differently. They all have different legal frameworks, different funding mechanisms, and on an individual level, they all start from different levels regarding the progress towards the implementation of the SDGs. So it is crucial, and we have to work on the stronger implementation and integration, on the stronger involvement of higher education institutions, as well as local stakeholder groups. I think it's also equally important that we work closely with NGOs. And there's one aspect I was missing a bit in the report. It's the student's perspective, especially when it comes to the design of policies and addressing teaching and learning. We should not forget about the students. Austrian students, they demand a say in the matter. And in fact, they are the drivers when it comes to sustainability at the higher education institutions. So thank you once again for the opportunity to share some thoughts on the report. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. All points well received. Again, I think those are excellent insights, especially from someone who is actually in the process of trying to make this happen, this connection, for instance, between policymakers and universities. Who should you speak to, the diversity? How can you reach out to the experts? I think these policy recommendations were meant to be read by persons like yourself. So we are really, really grateful as a research team and as an ARC9 team to hear those points. I think someone who has already asked a question, a colleague from UNESCO, Dr. Wesley Tetter, would be particularly happy with your point that we can come to in discussion later about the role of students and youth in regard to, of course, the SDGs in general, but also specifically in their achievement in the higher education sector. I'd like to thank all our 3 discussants for all their contributions, and may I call on them all to turn on their cameras and microphones, together with our researcher presenters, Dr. Anumoni Yoshi and Dr. Aisi Anabo-Fresno, so that we can have a roundtable discussion. For this roundtable discussion, I'll start with a general question that could be answered by everyone on the panel. And then we'll move on to some of the questions sent to us by our by the audience participating on this report launch webinar. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone on the panel, but also to those who are submitting questions. So please, if you have further questions, we have quite a few, which are really good. I'll try to be able to field as many as I can, but apologies in advance if we are not able to deal with your question. In any case, we do encourage all of those questions in case we're able to respond in writing, or that it contributes to the further development and thinking about this report. So first of all, well, it's the round table is a chance to give IC and Anumuni a chance to respond to the points raised by the discussants. But apart from that, I'd like to ask a general question that can structure our discussion. So the title of the research project is Mapping. Of course, the progress in the sector, what perspectives are there present in the sector on the SDGs, but I would say like the subtitle is working towards the achievement or working towards the SDGs. And in that respect, we know that the SDGs, which were adopted in 2015, are meant to be achieved, or the target date is 2030, which is just relatively short, 7 years away. They are an ambitious set of targets, and 7 years does not seem like a long time in which to achieve them. However, we have identified all of these policy tools, all of these practices on the part of, as we showed, over 400 universities. So the first question is really, from what we have presented today and from the research that the research team has done, what causes for hope do we have or have we seen regarding the achievement of these SDGs by 2030? And what are the areas of concern regarding this target of achieving these goals by 2030? There is some research, not least from UNESCO itself, that suggests we are behind schedule. But I guess the first question is about reasons for hope as well as for concern with regard to the achievement of these SDGs in the higher education sector, considering the stakeholders we've discussed. And perhaps I'll ask our researchers to answer these questions first, and then go back to our discussants.
May I?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Hi, yes, thank you so much for that, Miguel, and very, like a very important food for thought and a point for reflection for all of us. And my initial thoughts in this is that I think one of the main points of hope that we have is that we are seeing, based on the report and the evidence that we've collected, that there are initiatives that are already being done. There is a sense of ownership among leaders to push this forward and to work towards these using different policy tools. There are public statements of commitment towards these goals, and that also makes them a bit more accountable towards the people in the community that they serve. And the fact that we're all here, you know, as policymakers, university leaders, researchers, students, to work together into to engage in dialogues about how we can move this forward. Of course, there are important challenges, and I think we have all touched on that both in the presentations and in the discussions among our panelists. And as we all know, sustainable development, the heart of it is really integration, not just between the SDGs themselves, but also among the different stakeholders. And there is no one stakeholder that should, work towards this single-handedly. So this integration is always a challenge, because there is always the challenge of resources, of time, of having everyone come together, agree on specific goals, while allowing everyone to have the autonomy and the freedom to also pursue the goals they deem fit, especially that adapted to their local communities. So that is one of the main challenges, I think, that we still have to conquer as we move towards the sustainable development, achievement of sustainable development goals. And I think one of the things that we have also touched on is how, in terms of policy, the challenge of using the tools that we already have in terms of research, the evidence-based tools that are in our disposal. So in terms of setting goals, monitoring these goals, so we have quantitative modeling, we have systematic thinking, and all systems thinking, and all of these other tools that are probably not being used or leveraged between higher education institutions and policymakers that can potentially improve the way that we do policymaking with regard to the SDGs. So speaking to that point about how we can marry, or how we can combine science and policy and be able to improve this interface as we move towards the achievement of the SDGs. So yeah, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts as well on this.
Thank you, Icy. Anumani, anything to add to that? Or?
I'd just add to that since higher educations are very much invested, higher education institutions are very much invested with the sustainable development as a holistic approach. And it is promising because all of us are here and we are working towards it. We might not be able to contribute to, or we might not be able to see the large contribution at one point of time, but small drops in the ocean is going to make a bigger contribution. And I would like to say that if by 2030, if not all of the SDGs are achievable, but there could be, to a greater extent, some milestones will be achieved. Thank you.
Thanks, Anumani. I think that's a really important note that hopefully, well, no, not hopefully, we have demonstrated that some progress has been achieved. So the question really is that, should we be happy with that progress, or is that progress enough given the targets that have been set? And in no particular order, may I ask the discussants as well to comment on this particular target, and in their positions in their relative sectors, to maybe make a comment on that target and really the achievement of those targets based on what we've learned about today. Anyone? Professor Poncha.
Yes, I think that right now, I think that I have to say that it's not easy to achieve the target because we have pandemic and all kinds of things. But I think that the only thing that can be our hope is a leadership. We need the strong leadership from the university and from the policymaker. And then I think that yesterday I have a speaker talking about the climate change. Normally, when we have the speaker like this, not many people will be interested. But this time, I invite policymaker, I invite professor and student. But I have seen a lot of interest from the student. So I think that probably student involvement is quite important. And right now, they have more interest in this kind of problems. I think that right now, like in my country, the most important things about the students, they're interested in equality and also about the sustainability. So I think that my recommendation is that which is also, the same as a result of this survey, that more of the student involvement, leadership. And I think that university and policymaker have to work together. Like, in Thailand, they also have U2T university to Tambon or to district. We trying to make the university and the community to work together. But the most important thing is Asia and Europe. Because Asia Pacific, I think right now we have most of the population in the world. And we also the production base. And if we can couple it with good idea and knowledge from Europe, I think we can make a lot of change. If you look at the number, if you can change Asia and Pacific, probably it's easier to change the world. And when you can change the world, the more possibility to achieve the target, even if it's very difficult. That is my idea.
Thank you. Isabel, Anna?
Shall I go? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Yes, thank you for these inputs. And I would also like to recall the point by Mrs. Schinwald and by Professor Bornschein made on the student engagement. I think that's a very important point, which is also starting to happen and which can happen even more strongly. I wanted to comment on a point which came up regarding the 2030 deadline. I think that you also made, Dr. Lim, because yes, we have a very few years to go. We know that progress is being monitored on the SDGs by the United Nations and by governments, and it's being reviewed every year at the United Nations High-Level Political Forum in July. And we know that higher education is not yet as present as it could be as a key driver also of sustainability actions. So this is something that we also advocate for at the IAU with our members and our partners to show really that not just feeding into the research, but also into the actions that we can really contribute to a more sustainable future. And realistically, we know that it's very unlikely that we really achieve all the goals and targets set in the SDGs by 2030. But we know that it's the way to go. And in a way, the Sustainable Development Goals are a framework, are a tool on the path towards a more sustainable future. And I think that's our common objective, our common vision. Also beyond 2030 is to keep working on these important issues for more equality, for a more better living conditions for the environment, and really for more peace and partnerships as well. And this is what the 2030 agenda is comprised of. And we know that these I might as well share that there has been already the first round of dialogues virtually happening at the UN level, and then there will be an SDG summit this year in September. Also looking at where we are at, how the progress will look like. And even if we don't have SDGs after 2030, we will have some sort of framework, and I think this will build up on it, and higher education is much more active. So really, where we can be a strong voice, we can work close with governments, say the evidence is there, and that was just the comment that I had on that 2030 deadline. Because I would like to really encourage universities to get involved with the agenda, even though it's only 7 years left. I see it as one step on the way to a very much longer endeavor.
So don't lose hope is also one part of the message, which is important. Don't lose hope. 7 years is definitely time to speed up, but also not to lose hope, and obviously like an impetus to further engagement. Anna, maybe final comments till we move to questions from our audience, from our webinar audience.
Yes, thank you. What gives me hope is really the incredible wealth of knowledge and technologies that are currently being developed within our higher education institutions. So we see that science has a lot of solutions already on the table. And I think we have to listen to science, to the scientists. And to my mind, like the higher education institutions, they are really the front runners regarding sustainable development goals. And as somebody from the policymaker side, I think it's our responsibility to highlight that fighting climate change, implementing the SDGs is a national priority, and also to fight science skepticism. This is a huge topic that has unfortunately gained a lot of relevance during the COVID pandemic, at least in Austria. And the solutions are almost there. We just have to hear the voice of the scientists. So this is something I would like to highlight. And the second point is we have to be more, how should I say, we have to try stronger as a national authority to really reach the goals by 2030. And This is something that costs a lot of money, but it's completely necessary. And something I can mention from the Austrian perspective is that, for instance, we have set ourselves the goal that all public universities, not all higher education institutions, but at least all public universities are carbon neutral by 2035. So this is a very ambitious goal. This is quite cost intensive, but if we want universities to be if we always say universities are the front runners of society, they have to lead the way, and they have to make a start. And this is something that is expensive, but we should really spend that money. I think it's money well spent.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I think that does speak to obviously one of the findings, which is that financial incentives are the most commonly used tool. However, on the other side, what we have seen is the challenge that has been mentioned by the HEIs, as well as some of the policymakers themselves. They have consistently said lack of money as well. So it's the most commonly used tool, and yet it is also referred to as the choke point, as the limitation. So this is something that we can reflect on with regard to further commitment really towards the SDGs on the part of governments and HEIs concerned. So all reasons for hope that, despite this short timeline, that we will hopefully achieve something with respect to progress towards, if not the complete achievement, which does seem quite challenging, of the SDGs. But now to questions from the audience. And I think Anna raised a very important point regarding something that the study might consider further. I think we will definitely do this. ASEF, the Asia-Europe Foundation, clearly has a constituency and work in the role of students, and particularly youth. So I've actually specifically picked a question. Thank you very much to Dr. Wesley Tetter of UNESCO for raising this question. It wasn't the first question, but I'd like to ask it first on behalf of the students and youth who are the, I would say, less represented voice in this space at the moment. Dr. Tetter asks, for the policy recommendations, how can youth play a more meaningful role in SDG policymaking or monitoring going forward? And this question is both for the researchers as well as for our discussants. And anyone can raise their hand to start our discussion on this. Yes, Anumani.
All right, thank you. I think it's a very important question, because youth are going to shape our future tomorrow, and participation of youth has been essential in all aspects, just not in implementing SDG, but from all other aspects of the community and other societal developments. But in terms of engagement, I think as SDG, there are a lot different kinds of regulations and tools and authoritative tools, but whereas they are not really mandatory or asking the national governments to do certain things. But in terms of collecting the youth energy and channelizing that process, I think higher education institution can play a great role, because that's where the youth are concentrated from all across the globe. And having a specialized knowledge about SDG, and as evidence from our studies that we see that understanding of the SDGs in between the two studies, there is some disconnection from all staff and the administrative office, and even from the students. But channelizing that and utilizing that channel as a key to success of meeting the 2030 agenda, I think will be very, very useful. And having strategic programs or policies channelizing the youth energy. And I have seen the evidence from the higher education institution perspective that there were certain courses focusing youth on which they can work on the agenda. But I think more of those kind of courses and programs where institutions can develop to channelize that energy. And I think, yeah, that's it from my end.
Yes, Professor Porchai.
Yes, I think that this is quite important question. I think that firstly, we have to listen more to the youth initiative, because sometimes they also have a lot of good idea. And then the other thing that we can do is that we can have the youth camp on sustainability, like in my university or in the network of the university that I involve. The youth can exchange their idea, I mean, on site or even online. And I think that if we can expose to the youth from different countries, from different culture, they even can learn more. And I think that, but the most important thing is that try your best to involve of youth in all aspects of SDG, because I think that right now the youth across the world, they are interested in this thing. But the question is that whether we carefully listen to them or not. And then I think that what I like to propose is a youth camp, Asia-Europe youth camp, or many multi-national youth camp. You can travel, but if you care about the carbon credit, you also can do it online as well. But to expose the idea, I think is very good, and I also hope that in the future ASEF will help us to make this happen, and try your best to listen, and also listen to them carefully and let them involve in all activities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anna, any brief word or thought on that, on basically the point that you also raised? Any brief addition?
Yeah, I think it's important that we strengthen the youth's voice in higher education institutions, decision-making processes, to really give them a space in the structure. And I think it's also, it would be a good idea. I don't know if how it is in other countries, but to really provide them like space, like a room for networking at the universities. Like we do have some green students offices. It's just like to give them the opportunity to meet, to have a place where they can meet, to have an office. Sometimes it's very simple. And I think if we do not listen to the youth, we will have a problem in the near future. We experienced this like a couple of months ago. There were some students on several universities who occupied auditoriums because they said we want to be heard. So I think it's really crucial to take them seriously.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And clearly that's a subject that we'll need to return to again and again in the future. Dr. Agustinus Hermino asks several questions. In fact, he's been very generous in terms of contributing questions and also insights. But just to pick on one of his many questions, regarding the policy recommendations, are these for all countries, or can they be, I guess, adjusted? Is the term, to each region, such as ASEAN, Europe, etc., based on our considerations? Yeah, maybe I'd like to put that to our researcher presenters.
Hello. Yes, probably I can take that on. Yes, well, thank you so much, Miguel. And thank you so much, Dr. Agustina Hermino. It's so good to see you in the comments. And thank you for your thoughtful questions. So definitely, this is something that as we can tell, the report is geared towards the national context, as it is the main unit of analysis that we have used also in terms of like how just the ASEM is structured. But definitely it is something that we will need to consider, as well as parts of these regional networks, to be able to adopt these policy recommendations across the different national contexts in your own regions. So for example, these developing closer collaborations between higher education institutions and governments, definitely, for example, the European Commission and the ASEAN can work towards these initiatives. So I think now there are many tools that are being conducted or being used as mechanisms to foster these collaborations, but always there is something else we can do, something else we can improve on. Also, ASEF as an institution is and can bring different stakeholders between these different regions together, which is what we're doing now. And this is something that definitely will have to be continued. And yes, we can reflect on these different policy recommendations together and exchange our ideas. So yes, the short-winded answer is yes.
Thank you, Icy. And speaking of short answers, as well as trying to go through some questions, perhaps I'd like to pose this question from an anonymous attendee to Anumoni, because she's worked in a way on the studies on both perspectives. And our attendee asks, is there a discrepancy in the understanding and the interpreting of SDGs by the government and the HEIs? What did our study find with regard to this point?
Thank you for it's an interesting question, and thank you for asking that question and presenting it, Miguel. I think from both the studies perspective, from the policymakers as well as from the higher education institution, we did realize that the understanding of the whole sustainable development there is a discrepancy and there is certain level of knowledge gap, but at the same time it also provides opportunity of learning from each other and understanding what it is actually needed. So yes, to answer that one simple question, that yes, there is a gap in holistically understanding, but that does not mean that endeavors are not made or the mechanisms are not placed in place. But both from the Asia and the Europe, there were regional differences when we saw that what is the understanding of these sustainable development goals from the institution perspective and from the policymakers perspective. I think there needs to be a more connections, but the institutions and the national level policymakers need to talk to each other or more to understand them holistically to implement those development goals.
Thank you so much, Anumoni. And Isabel, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to comment on that. So I agree with Dr. Yashi that also the interconnectedness is not always there. This idea that really one SDGs cannot be regarded in isolation, but there's a lot of connections to other SDGs. If we look at 13, we cannot look at climate without looking at energy, without looking at water. We cannot look at inequalities without looking at women, but then we will also look at climate because it might cause new forms of inequalities in society. In terms of understanding for the SDGs, I did briefly mention earlier, we had a question, the part also in our survey that asked respondents how they understood different concepts related to sustainable development. I mean, sustainable development as a concept has been around since the Brundtland Report in 1967, so defining sustainable development as a form of development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. And that's sort of our starting point there. Also in the higher education, say, short history of sustainable development. But then we have more recent concepts, which is also global citizenship education, which is very high on the UNESCO agenda and important to really also educate the citizens of today and the leaders and experts of tomorrow. Education for sustainable development, very strongly around SDG 4, where UNESCO also has the mandate for SDG 4 in this UN system, and the SDGs as a framework for sustainable development that closely complement these concepts. And I mean, what we found and what we've asked people also since in the first iteration already in 2016, what's their understanding of sustainable development? And the majority in a couple of years ago still understood it as an environmental concept. And now this understanding is getting more holistic, and they see also the social and economic and partnerships perspective on this. So this, I mean, just to say that there's still a lot of projects that say greening of universities and only look at the environmental perspective. These are, I must frankly say, a bit reductionist. So we really would want to have universities work on a more holistic way.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Professor Ponce has his hand up, but we have arrived. I must ask perhaps the last question just because of the time limitations, I'll move on to another question by R. Carlina Lubis, and we can end on this question. There are many questions that were raised that were really very, very important and interesting. So apologies again to all of those who may have raised questions but were not discussed. I invite you really to read the report and to reach out to us, the report researchers, as well as ASEF, the report organizers, as well as to discussants today. But our Carlina Lubis asks, could you please share success stories regarding the way you promote interdisciplinary collaboration? I guess in the context of the SDGs, as Isabel has mentioned, I think you can't achieve one of the SDGs without achieving the other. But we know that, like experts in economic growth are not necessarily experts on marine diversity, and marine diversity experts are not, perhaps they have a different set of expertise as those working in gender equality issues. So perhaps to Professor Pornchai regarding success stories, and anyone else would be welcome as well to chip in a final word before we hand over, just to have quick responses before we hand over to our organizers.
What I like to say is that even there's no SDG, there's a need for interdisciplinary within higher education already, because otherwise it cannot respond to the new phenomena. And when we have SDG, we saw this as a help, because if we like to solve any problems towards each of SDG, clearly we need the interdisciplinary. And in order to do that, we have to set the goal, use the project base, and then having many people from many disciplines to involve. I think that this is my response. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to speak about the interdisciplinary nature or requirements for the achievement of the SDGs? Perhaps a perspective from Anna, from the policymakers?
Yes, but I would like to present an example from the universities in Austria. There is a network which is called UNINETS, which is the abbreviation for Universities and Sustainable Development. And there are about approximately 20 universities and 300 scientists involved. And they looked at the SDGs and they developed 150 options and 950 measures of how Austria could implement each SDG. So it took them 3 years. It was a very long and complicated process, but they managed to do it. And I think it's really a best practice example for interdisciplinary cooperation. So I can maybe put it in the chat, the link, if you want to have a look. It's well worth looking at. Thank you.
On that note, which is the entire, I suppose, goal of this project, which is to share ideas, paths forward, reasons for hope, as we discussed earlier. That was a very concrete example, but our report hopefully shines light on many other concrete examples and the documents in which they are embedded. So thank you again to our researchers who presented the ARC9 research, and thank you to our discussants who really helped us to go deeper, to identify items of value, as well as next directions for this research. Thank you very much to everyone on this roundtable. And now I pass us on back to our organizers at the Asia Europe Foundation, Reika and Miguel and their team.
Thank you so much, Miguel, for moderating this fantastic discussion, and thank you so much for all of you contributing with these valuable thoughts. So just to close the session, and we want to share what's next after the report. We are very proud to have completed this report, and we hope this will serve as a source of inspiration for policymakers and university practitioners. But I'm happy to share that we are also going to take action to make that happen. And we are organizing policy dialogues throughout 2023 this year. We are planning for one edition to take place in Asia during the summer, and another one in Europe during the autumn. And during these policy discussions, we would like to invite policymakers, university and student leaders especially, because it was stressed a lot of times during the discussions as well how important student voice is. And ASEF is a fantastic network of young and student leaders. So we are committed to bring them on board and discuss the findings of this report with them and hear from them what they can do to contribute to sustainable development through higher education. And with this nice diverse mix of participants, we are also planning to do policy recommendations that will be presented to the ASEM Education Ministers at their next meeting. So I know many of you here in the audience are also involved in at least in one of these capacities. So I invite you to let us know in case you're interested in joining these policy dialogues, and drop us an email at arc@asef.org. And then we will be happy to send you the invitation firsthand when we confirm the places, the venues and the dates of these policy dialogues. And with this, I would like to say thank you for another group of contributors that were not mentioned today, our researchers and their advisory group. Because we had 8 members of the advisory group helping this project with their critical insights and suggestions. So we are very grateful for their contribution as well. We will put in the chat the list of the advisory board, but they are also featured in the reports. And I saw some of them joining today as well. And thank you so much. We are really grateful. So with this, we close the session. We hope you enjoyed and continue your day with a couple of key thoughts and reflecting on your role, either as a policymaker, a higher education leader, a student. That what is it that you can do differently, and where would be the partners in Asia and Europe to collaborate with on the SDGs. So thank you so much again, and stay in touch if you want to follow the next steps of this project. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.